Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something pretty significant. Did one speech just fundamentally change the game in Asia?
We're talking about U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's recent remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore.
Exactly. His assessment of the threat from China seems, well, sharper than what we've heard before.
Yeah, and we've gathered quite a bit to unpack this news articles on the speech itself, China's official responses, analysis from regional experts, that sort of thing.
So our mission here is to go through these sources, pull like the key takeaways, understand that, the different perspectives.
And figure out what this tougher talk actually means for security in the region and for, well, the whole U.S.-China relationship.
Okay, let's set the scene. This was the Shangri-La Dialogue, May 30th, 2025, in Singapore. It's a really big deal, this annual defense summit.
Top defense officials from around the world show up, and the U.S. Defense Secretary's speech. Always highly anticipated. It's seen as a major policy statement for the Indo-Pacific.
But something was different this year, even before he spoke.
Right. China didn't send its defense minister. That was unusual. And Hegseth actually pointed that out right at the start, kind of set a tone.
And then came the core message. This is what really made waves, a much, much stronger assessment of the threat from China.
He didn't mince words. The sources quote him directly. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent.
Imminent. That word just jumps out because, for years the official line was always conflict is neither imminent nor inevitable.
Exactly. Shifting to could be imminent, that signals a pretty significant change in how Washington views the risk, or at least the timeline.
So what's the strategy behind this starker assessment?
Well, he laid it out pretty clearly. Again, from the sources, the approach is we are preparing for war in order to deter war to achieve peace through strength.
Classic deterrence theory, then. Build up strength so the other side doesn't dare start anything.
Precisely. Peace through strength. And this is all based on the U.S. view that China is actively getting ready to potentially use force.
Use force to do what, according to Hegseth?
To change the balance of power. He framed China as aiming to become a hegemonic power, wanting to, dominate and control large parts of Asia.
Implying China wants to reshape the region to suit its own interests, possibly overriding others.
That's the implication, yes. And he didn't just leave it as a general statement. He gave specific examples.
Like what?
Well, he pointed directly to China's actions in the South China Sea, citing things like ramming Philippine vessels.
Which we've seen reported quite a bit.
Right. And also the increased military drills around Taiwan. He explicitly called those rehearsals for a potential blockade or even an invasion.
Rehearsals? That's strong language. Did he mention that 2027 date we sometimes hear about?
He did touch on it. He noted it's something U.S. officials attribute to Xi Jinping, a timeline for China having the capability to take Taiwan. Though it's important to say Beijing hasn't confirmed that.
Still, the warning about Taiwan was severe.
Oh, absolutely. He warned an invasion would have devastating consequences for the Indo-Pacific and the world, really highlighting the global stakes.
Okay, so a very sharp warning. But did he offer any balancing points, any reassurances?
Yes, the sources show he did try to balance it. He reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to the Indo-Pacific, calling it the priority theater.
And stressed the importance of allies.
Very much so. Stressed the value of allies and partners and said the U.S. would keep sending forces to the Western Pacific. He also added caveats, the U.S. doesn't seek conflict, doesn't want to strangle China, doesn't seek regime change.
But the bottom line was?
The bottom line was ensuring China cannot dominate the U.S. or its allies. Deterrence is key.
Which brings us to the allies. What was the message for them specifically?
Yes. This was another really pointed part of the speech. He was very direct. Allies and partners need to do their part. They need to shoulder more of the military burden.
So not just relying on the U.S. then?
Not at all. He basically said, look, deterrence does not come cheap. Everyone needs to invest more in their own defense. He even pointed to Europe increasing spending as an example for Asia to follow.
And we saw that quote from Elbridge Colby, the Pentagon policy lead, suggesting allies, particularly in Asia, aim for maybe 5% of GDP on defense. That's a huge ask.
A very significant ask, yes.
Yeah.
It shows the seriousness of the U.S. push for burden sharing. And it wasn't just military spending either.
Right. He touched on the economic side, too.
Yeah, he cautioned countries about trying to sort of play both sides. Strong economic ties with China, strong defense ties with the U.S.
What was the concern there?
He warned them to beware the leverage that the CCP seeks with that entanglement. Basically, the U.S. view is that China might use economic dependence as a weapon against U.S. allies.
Okay. So a really assertive U.S. stance. Threats rising, maybe imminent, we need deterrence, allies must pay more, and be careful about China's economic influence. How did Beijing take all this?
Predictably, not well. The sources say China's reaction was swift and strong. They accused the U.S. of trying to sow division, making groundless accusations.
And basically wrecking the peace in the region.
Pretty much. Deliberately destroying regional peace and stability, and they completely flipped the script on that whole hegemony accusation.
So
China's line, repeated here, is that the U.S. is the real hegemonic power, that the U.S. military presence and actions are the main source of instability in the Asia-Pacific.
what about the specific things Hegseth mentioned, like the South China Sea incidents or the Taiwan drills?
On the South China Sea, China maintained there's no issue with freedom of navigation, said it exercises high degrees restraint, and again blamed U.S. military activities as the biggest threat.
In Taiwan.
Same consistent line.
Yeah.
It's purely an internal affair. They warned the U.S. very directly not to use Taiwan as leverage or to, quote, play with fire.
So two completely opposite stories being told. U.S. says China's the imminent threat. China says the U.S. is the destabilizer. What did the actual countries in the region make of Hegseth's speech?
Now that's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite mixed. The sources show a real spectrum of reactions.
Some weren't happy with the tone.
Definitely. Some experts called Hegseth's remarks highly provocative, worried it could actually raise tensions, make things less stable, not more.
And does everyone in Asia see China as this imminent threat that Hegseth described?
That's a key point. Many in the region, while certainly concerned about China's actions, don't necessarily share that same sense of imminence that Washington projects. Conflict doesn't feel quite so close at hand to them.
And they might be wary of getting pulled into a direct U.S.-China confrontation.
Exactly. There's a reluctance to be forced into choosing sides, especially given the deep economic ties most Asian countries have with China. Plus, some sources noted skepticism about the U.S. as a pure stabilizer, sometimes pointing to past U.S. actions elsewhere.
What about the directness of the criticism against China?
Some felt it was maybe inappropriate for that kind of dialogue forum. And that message about allies needing to spend more, some perceived it as, well, transactional.
Like the U.S. is just focused on the military dollars.
That was a sentiment reported in some analyses.
Yeah.
Also, there's a difference in how threats are perceived. Asia generally sees the China challenge differently than, say, how Europe sees the Russia threat. It's more complex, more interwoven economically.
But it wasn't all negative, right? Some allies must have welcomed the strong U.S. stance.
Oh, for sure. Countries worried about freedom of navigation or feeling pressured by China's actions in places like the South China Sea likely welcomed the strong U.S. commitment and presence. Even if they feel intimidated by China, the U.S. focus is valued.
And the host country, Singapore?
Singapore's defense minister welcomed the U.S. commitment, but also stressed the importance of dialogue, like the Shangri-La Forum itself, precisely to avoid miscalculation, even with China's lower-level delegation this year. That signals a regional desire to keep talking.
Okay, so zooming out a bit, how does this moment, this speech, fit into the bigger picture of U.S.-China relations?
Well, you have to see it against the backdrop of decades of really complex history. Periods of high tension, Taiwan crises, trade wars, but also periods of engagement, like Nixon's visit or normalizing trade.
But the last few years have felt different, more tense, consistently.
They really have. Across the board, trade, tech, human rights, and definitely military posturing, especially near Taiwan and in the South China Sea. Hegseth's speech, by explicitly using language like imminent, feels like a public marker.
A marker of what?
Maybe a marker that, in Washington's view, the era of hoping conflict was avoidable or distant is over. That the assessment of China's intentions has fundamentally shifted, and the need for urgent preparation is now the primary message.
So wrapping this up, what's the main takeaway from our deep dive today?
I think the core tension is crystal clear. The U.S. is now publicly framing China as a potentially imminent threat, demanding serious deterrence efforts and much greater contributions from allies.
While China pushes back hard, painting the U.S. as the actual destabilizing force and aggressor in the region.
And crucially, the view from within the region itself is not monolithic. Many countries are caught in the middle, concerned by China, but also wary of the U.S. approach, and not sharing that same sense of immediate crisis. That gap in perception is huge.
Right. So given these clashing views, the heightened rhetoric, and the calls for more military readiness, it really leaves you wondering, What's the actual path forward here? How can peace and stability realistically be maintained in the Indo-Pacific when the major players see the situation so differently?
That's the big question hanging in the air after this. Something for all of us, including you listening, to really think about.